Hello and welcome to Classics Now. Our festival presents artists' reinterpretation and reimaginings of the art, literature, and ideas of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and it explores what these have to say to us today. Our second festival programme includes live performances and events in Dublin city centre, as well as online in-conversation events such as the one you're about to watch right now. For full programme information, for booking and for links to all of our videos and films, please visit classicsnow.ie. And I hope that you'll find over the weekend and watching whenever you want to later on, that there's something in the programme for you that you find interesting or thought-provoking, that you discover something, and above all, that you enjoy it. And I'd like to thank you very much for joining us.
Welcome to Classics Now. My name is Anna Carey and I am absolutely delighted to be here for the opening event and talking to Madeline Miller, who I'm sure you all know is the author of the Song of Achilles and Circe. And she's joining us tonight to talk about both those books, about the classical world, and to answer some questions from students all over the country who have been reading her novels. So welcome, Madeline.
Hello, thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here. And thank you so much, Anna. This is such a delight to get to speak with you tonight.
Oh, well, my pleasure. So we are going to talk about a lot of things tonight, but we're going to start off with hearing a little from one of your novels. Can you tell us a bit about this extract that you're going to read?
Sure, I'm going to read a short passage from Circe. Circe in Greek mythology is the daughter of the sun god Helios. She is a goddess and she's also a witch. In this passage, she has already started doing the thing she is most famous for, which is turning men into pigs. And she's having a conversation with Odysseus, the Greek hero. He asked me once, "Why pigs?" We were seated before my hearth in our usual chairs. He liked the one draped in cowhide, with silver inlaid in its carvings. Sometimes he would rub the scrolling absently beneath his thumb. "Why not?" I said. He gave me a bare smile. "I mean it, I would like to know." I knew he meant it. He was not a pious man, but the speaking out of things hidden, this was his highest worship. There were answers in me, I felt them, buried deep as last year's bulbs growing fat. Their roots tangled with those moments I had spent against the wall, when my lions were gone and my spell shut up inside me. After I changed a crew, I would watch them, scrabbling and crying in the sty, falling over each other, stupid with their horror. They hated it all, their newly voluptuous flesh, their delicate split trotters, their swollen bellies dragging in the earth's muck. It was a humiliation, a debasement. They were sick with longing for their hands, those appendages men use to mitigate the world. "Come," I would say to them. "It's not that bad. You should appreciate a pig's advantages. Mud slick and swift, they are hard to catch. Low to the ground, they cannot easily be knocked over. They're not like dogs. They do not need your love. They can thrive anywhere, on anything, scraps and trash. They look witless and dull, which lulls their enemies, but they are clever. They will remember your face." They never listened. The truth is, men make terrible pigs.
Oh, that's one of the bits that stuck in my mind most when I read the book. It's just magnificently chilling, even though we're on her side when we when we read it. And I mean, obviously, this book was the product of a lifetime of being interested in the classical world. And I know that you studied Latin and ancient Greek in school and then in college, and then you taught it. But what was the early aha moment that made you interested in the ancient world? or was there one? Was it or?
I think there were a couple. I think the first one really came with my mother. My mother had taken a classics course, and she had fallen in love with classics, although she wasn't a classicist, she was an English major. And she decided to read me little pieces of the Iliad and the Odyssey as bedtime stories. And I have a memory of her reading the first line of the Iliad, "Sing, goddess of the destructive rage of Achilles," and just thinking, oh my gosh, who is this Achilles? Why is he so angry? I feel like I should also say that I liked Winnie the Pooh as well, and Goodnight Moon and those books. But there was something about this that felt intensely real and powerful to me. And I wanted to understand the gods and goddesses. I wanted to understand, the monsters, but also I really loved the humanity. I felt like that these were stories about real things, about grief and war and courage and folly and love and parents and children. And all of that was very gripping to me.
So you did, so it wasn't, the adulterated kids, stories from Greek myths. You did go straight in with Homer from the start.
I definitely read my share of, retellings. I have, vivid memories of reading the Dolaires, which is a retelling of myths that's very popular here in America. So I definitely did those too. But yes, it was that. And then we were very fortunate to live. I was growing up in New York City at the time, and this was sort of the other piece of it. And we went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which has this incredible antiquities collection. And walking through the halls and looking at the incredible statues, I have so many memories of just staring up at these gorgeous statues and, falling in love with these myths and these stories and the realism, again, of the emotions on the faces. Now, of course, looking back at that, one thing I wish I had known is that all those statues, which we sort of see as these pale, stark statues, were all vividly painted in the ancient world. Yeah. But I didn't know that then.
And because that interest in the stories and the myths and the figures is one thing, but you did go on to study Latin and ancient Greek. Now I did Latin all the way through secondary school, but ancient Greek always seemed like an even further commitment. So did the languages live up to your interest in the ancient world, or when you're conjugating Mo Massamat, did you ever think, maybe this isn't quite as exciting?
The languages absolutely did, and I think if it weren't for the languages, I might have sort of lost interest and gone on to someplace else. So I was very fortunate to have a wonderful Latin teacher when I was in high school, starting when I was around age 15, and he was just so brilliant at bringing the language alive. And I had always been a child who loved secrets. Maybe that's true of all writers. And, I always wanted to kind of see into things. And so looking back at an ancient language felt like the ultimate secret, that, getting to decode this and sort of read these words that had been written so long ago or composed so long ago. And once I started reading Latin poetry, in particular Virgil, that was it for me. I was in love. I was obsessed with Latin poetry. And then this wonderful Latin teacher offered me the opportunity to learn Greek with him. So I learned Greek and we started reading the Iliad, and knowing that as soon as I learned Greek, I would get to read the Iliad in the original. That sort of helped with the pain of the the conjugating and the declining and the memorization. That part is very boring, but the poetry was worth it. And, it was electrifying, being able to read those lines that I had fallen in love with so long ago in the original, and to see, how much richer they were, and the power of the language and the rhythm really just, it blew my mind. And so I knew going to college that was what I wanted to study. I wanted to keep digging into the languages, the poetry, and the literature.
And there is something genuinely magical when the original words speak to you across centuries. Because I remember studying Catullus in secondary school. We did I think it's the Catullus 5. It's the Dami Basia Mille, that give me 1,000.
Yes.
But you know, you're a 16-year-old girl as well, just like, oh, this is not Caesar's Gallic Wars. And there is something kind of astounding. It is one of those moments where you're struck by the fact that even though obviously people experience the world in a different way in, 2,000 years ago, there is still this common humanity that can just connect you with somebody directly when you're reading what they wrote centuries before you were born.
Yes.
And when you were in, so how did you go from teaching or studying the classical world to wanting to tell your own stories set in that world? Because I know, like, after college, you were teaching classics. So had you always wanted to tell your own stories about the figures that you were reading about, or did that sort of slowly creep up in you?
I had always wanted to be a writer and to write from when I was very young also, but it never occurred to me to put the two together for many, many years. That the whole time that I was studying classics and I was in high school and I was falling in love with Virgil and Homer, at the same time over here, I was reading almost completely contemporary authors. I was reading authors like Toni Morrison and Margaret Atwood and Isabel Allende, and I read a lot of magical realism. I really loved a lot of the Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I was wanting to write, and I was writing stories that were set in the contemporary world. They had no classical influence at all. And when I got to college, I actually decided to write a novel while I was at college. And I did this totally on my own time. It was a terrible novel. It was junk. It will never see the light of day. My poor roommate had to listen to so many passages from it. I'm still apologizing to this day. But it was really important for me. I feel like I was learning how to write. I was really learning how to kind of put ideas together, how to tell a story. So I think that novel, even though it was, junk, I think it was very important to me growing as a writer. And I also read as many books on writing by writers as I could. Whenever, I would go to the bookstore, if there was a book by a writer about how to be a writer, I would read that and absorb that. And so, these two tracks were kind of, existing completely parallel to each other. And then the moment of revelation for me actually happened through theater. I had also always been interested in theater, but I was much too shy for acting. That was not going to be in the cards for me. But my senior year of college, a good friend of mine asked me to co-direct a production of Shakespeare's Troilus and Cressida, which is Shakespeare's version of the Iliad. And I didn't know very much about Shakespeare or directing, but I figured I could bring the Iliad part. And so he and I embarked on this, and it was one of the most exciting things I had ever done in my life. Here I was talking to the actor who was playing Achilles about what his motivation was, and I was working on the costumes, and I was choreographing the sword fights. I mean, first of all, it was, nerd heaven, but it was also really intellectually engaging. And up until that, moment, I had interacted with the classics, very passionately, but never from a perspective of me sort of reaching in and being part of telling the story myself. And this was the moment where I started doing that. And it was so exciting that when the play finished and I graduated and I was heading off to graduate school, and then after that off to teaching, I thought, I don't want to stop doing this. And so I had planned going into graduate school on writing my graduate master's on interpretations of Achilles and Patroclus as lovers through the centuries. So if any of you have read Song of Achilles, you'll know where that research went. But what I realized is that the things that I wanted to say about Achilles and Patroclus actually were not a master's thesis. They were a novel. And so it was right after that play that I started writing Song of Achilles. Now, it took me 10 years from that point, but that was the beginning.
Well, actually, that is one of the questions that one of the schools asked. I think it was Naas Community College in Kildare did want to know how long it took to write the Song of Achilles. So now they have their answer. 10 years. It is, but I guess a lifetime as well, going into the reading, everything surrounding the story. And I mean, did you, when you were, is it the characters that you've chosen to tell stories about, even though they play very significant roles or sort of memorable roles in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, they're kind of, they're not the protagonists of the story. There's sort of space around them that you can, um, develop on yourself. What was it about those particular characters, Circe and Patroclus, that really appealed to you?
I think that there were two things, and thank you to the students for that question, by the way. If I had known going into it, it would take me 10 years, I think it would have been a lot harder. I kept telling myself, oh, just one more year and then I'll be finished. So I sort of tricked myself through it. But I think there were two things about each of the characters that drew me in. And just before I say what those two things were, I think one of the things for me about writing is that there was no moment where I was thinking, oh, I want to talk about, I want to write about the ancient world. What characters should I write about? It was that these were characters that really possessed me. And they were characters that I had been thinking about for a long time. And I had really passionate things to say. And then the two things that I think were true about each of them is I felt like there was a mystery surrounding them that I was really engaged in. And also there was something around the character that made me really angry. And in the case of Patroclus, it was the fact that I felt like the interpretation of Achilles and Patroclus as lovers, while it was totally accepted in the ancient world as a possible interpretation, there were also other people in the ancient world who interpreted them as the closest of friends. Both those existed in the ancient world. But in modern scholarship, that was not getting talked about when I was going through school and grad school. And luckily, I think that's changing a lot now, but that interpretation had basically dropped away. And it had been sort of, forcibly closeted, basically. And I was really frustrated by that. I felt like, there's no good reason for doing that except homophobia. And I feel like that this interpretation of them as lovers is a very powerful thread in the history of understanding the Iliad. And so I really wanted to make the case for that as a very powerful interpretation. And then there was the mystery. And the mystery was, who is this Patroclus who means so much to Achilles? We hear that he's the most beloved companion of Achilles in the Iliad. But we don't really see them interacting very much. He's kind of always in the background. And we don't, see much of their relationship except for, spoiler alert, but, it is 3,000 years old, the story, when Patroclus dies. And then we see sort of the crater that's left in Achilles' life. And so trying to understand, Homer shows us the end of their relationship, but what might the beginning look like? Who is this man that can, leave that kind of huge crater in Achilles' life? Because so much of the Iliad is Achilles telling us that the only thing that matters to him is his reputation and his pride and, getting Agamemnon to apologize and this whole sort of power struggle he's having with Agamemnon. And then when Patroclus dies, all that is gone. The only thing that matters is his death and sort of his grief and Achilles' rage. So that was a piece of it, sort of that mystery, understanding this character who, as you say, had space around them, and also sort of pushing back at something that I felt like was an injustice in terms of the way the characters was looked at. And then similarly with Circe, there's a lot of mystery around her. The section of the Odyssey that covers Circe is actually narrated by Odysseus himself. Much of the Odyssey is narrated by the poet, the epic poet, whoever that is. But that section is actually told by Odysseus to some people he's staying with and trying to get help from. Now, Odysseus, as you may know, is the great liar of ancient literature. He's the spin master, he's the politician, it makes him a great storyteller, but he is constantly burnishing his own legend. And so, the Circe episode is not only kind of buried under the male heroic tradition, but it's also buried under Odysseus's agenda to make himself look good. Oh, there's this terrifying witch, and I totally tamed her, and then she threw herself at me, and she was super hot, and she invited, that's the way Odysseus is telling the story about Circe. So Circe is very otherized in the Odyssey. She's presented as this sort of beautiful, mysterious woman who hangs out all the time, looking fabulous, just waiting for someone to show up on her island. And I thought, let's see if we can move from her being the object this sort of fantasy object that Odysseus is constructing to how she actually feels. How can we make her the subject of this story? And I guess that's where the anger comes in, is that I felt very frustrated by, it was a very flat portrait. It's a very sexist portrait. It's a very, as I said, male fantasy portrait. And also the fact that she is represented in later versions of her story after Homer as being this terrifying figure, the man-hater, the spider at the center of the web. She's really treated like a villain. She's often put in the same category as, Medea and Clytemnestra, some of the great villains of Greek mythology, both of whom I personally love. But I think that, Circe is becomes such a lightning rod for male anxiety about female power. And witches, I think, have always been that. And there's Circe as a witch. And so that was very interesting to me too, is how she's gathered all these very negative stories around her. But when you look at her in the Odyssey, other than the whole turning to pigs thing after that, she is one of the most helpful characters that Odysseus encounters. She's wise, she's clever, she's kind. She offers him and his men harbor when they don't have any other options and when they don't know what they're doing. And so I thought it was interesting that whole part, this benevolent healing part of Circe, has been kind of eclipsed.
And you do, as well as being a witch, she is also, part of the, does she count as part of the pantheon? I don't know strictly, but she is a divine figure. And one of the things that I think is particularly effective about the book, which I really loved, is the portrayal of divinity as a sort of, as a concept and as an experience and as a being, and how, they're not just humans with powers. There's something else, and they're immortal with everything that brings with it. I mean, what was it that drew you to exploring that aspect of the mythological narrative?
I mean, everything you're saying is so true about the gods, that their alienness to human life is always really noticeable and resonant whenever they appear in stories. And I have always been struck by how incredibly cruel and selfish they are on the whole. That yes, they have their favorites who they might stick up for, but for the most part, they're only interested in sort of themselves and their own desires. And even their desire to help their favorites is really about sort of their own reputation and what they like. And so, if we were going to get diagnostic in a modern psychological context, we might call them sociopathic narcissists. They want what they want and they do whatever they want. They're capricious, petty, vengeful. If you make them angry, they'll punish you, but not just you, your children and your children's children and their children, sort of on down through the centuries, unless someone makes them stop. So as I was looking at gods and thinking about gods, I was thinking about the fact that, these are beings without empathy. And I'm always really interested in how psychology, because I think the Greeks were incredibly, and I think this is true of myths in general, not just Greek myths, are incredibly psychologically astute. And it turns out that psychologically, this is actually something that happens to people in real life. That if you are lifted out of sort of a human context where you face hardship and you face sort of consequences for your actions, and you're placed in this category where there aren't any consequences on your actions, and you don't really have to struggle very much, it turns out that what happens to humans is that our empathy starts dropping. It's possible to fight against that. And the way you fight against it is by remembering a time that you felt powerless. And that will sort of re-engage you with your own empathy. But if you're not interested in, in fighting against it, if perhaps you enjoy thinking, I'm up here because I deserved it, so if you're down there, it must be because you deserved it, which means I can do whatever I want to you. If you start to kind of get into that mindset, basically you start living like a Greek god. Mm. So I was really interested in what would it be like to be born among, beings like that, as Circe. And as I was thinking about Circe, I always go back to the original. I'm like a little magpie, and I sort of go through and I pick up all these little details, and I never know what is going to sprout. But one of the details in Homer as a description of Circe is she's described as being the dread goddess who speaks like a human. And it's just one word in the Greek, audeasa, speaking like a human. And I was really intrigued by that. What does it mean to be a goddess who speaks like a human? And it's kind of a debated word. It can also, sometimes people translate it as speaks in human languages. But I thought, for me as a novelist, what that meant is that there's a piece of Circe that understands the human world. There's a piece of Circe who is drawn to humans and who can feel empathy and who can reach out to humanity and who can experience emotionally things that humans experience. And so that was kind of the core of the story for me, is here's this goddess who is born, to among all these greater gods, but she is capable of feeling empathy. And there are a few other gods who do that sort of in the Greek pantheon. We see Prometheus, who also makes an appearance in the novel. And in general, though, the gods, I also found it interesting that the gods who tend to be the most sympathetic, Prometheus aside, tend to be the lesser gods. It is the nymphs. It's the gods who are closest to humans, who are able to be most helpful and most sort of kind. So all of that I was kind of thinking about as I was constructing the world of the gods and the world of Circe and the conflict, as someone who's kind of has a foot in each world.
And as part of her world and her exercising her own power, I found the way you write about her practicing magic, it was just so incredibly evocatively done. And as somebody who likes knitting and making stuff, I really was kind of astonishing that it felt like craft, like it felt like craft work. What and that is a sort of an ongoing, thread through the book is how she works at the magic. What was it about that aspect of the sort of more witchy, I suppose, aspect that appeals to you as a writer?
I love that you bring up knitting and crafts, because that was at the core of sort of how I thought about Circe, not only with her witchcraft, but with her weaving and her singing. She is devoted, she's dedicated to crafts, gardening. And, one of the things that I think, there are a few kind of key moments of craft work in the ancient epics. Penelope, for instance, in the Odyssey, weaving at her loom and playing this trick on the suitors, where she says, I'll choose one of you to marry as soon as I'm done weaving this shroud. And then at night she goes and unravels it every night and then weaves again. But other than that, things that were traditionally associated with women, like craft work, were seen as not important enough for epic. And so part of what I wanted to do in sort of telling Circe, setting Circe at the center of her own epic, was to really highlight her ability with those crafts, and to make them epic. And then, of course, witchcraft to me has always felt like such a way into anything creative, because in the ancient Greek world, witchcraft was really very different from divine power. Divine power happened like that. It's, you want it and you manifest it in the world, whereas witchcraft takes discipline and work and gathering the right ingredients and knowing the right words and making the potion. And it takes this sort of concentration, experience, trial and error that really appealed to me as a writer. But I think the same is true for visual artists, for dancers, choreographers, people, knitters, crafters of all kinds, that this is not something that comes from snapping your fingers. It comes from work and experience and passion for what you're doing. And I did not intend, any of you who have read Circe, the parts in the beginning where she's first learning her magic, when she first arrives on the island of Aiaia, I did not intend those to be portraits of my writing process, but when I read over them, I was like, this sounds this sounds familiar. A lot of throwing away, a lot of mistakes. So I love that part of Circe, and identifying her as an artist, that in sort of witchcraft as her art was, the central part of her story for me. That, this is a woman who's an artist and who is using her art as a way to try to transform and understand the world.
That was one of my that was one of my favorite parts of the novel too. So Yeah, it's just it's also, as you say, it's focusing a sort of traditionally female um, pursuit at the center of the epic narrative. But there have been, especially in the last few years, there's been your books, there's been Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, which I absolutely loved. Pat Barker's book about the Trojan women, and Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad. Why do you think there's such an appetite and an enthusiasm at the moment for feminist re-examinings or retellings, or just working with these stories that are literally thousands of years old?
That's such a good question. And I also love Emily Wilson's translation. I'm so excited she's working on the Iliad right now. I cannot wait to see what she does with that. But I think that for me, so many of us grew up with these stories. And, even as I loved them growing up and listening to my mom read them and, reading them in class and reading them on my own, I was also intensely frustrated by them. I felt like, the female characters were incredibly flattened. I felt like they were these absurd caricatures. I felt like if they had any power, they were always punished for it. And I remember that feeling of frustration. Where are the three-dimensional, interesting, complicated women? And, you get more of that in tragedy. And you can certainly, kind of project it into the stories. I mean, that's what's so interesting about the stories, is that I feel like they're set in this amazingly rich world. And so it's very easy to kind of put that in and project that complexity and embroider. But they just, for the most part, tragedy aside, they don't get that much stage time. Women tend to just be kind of daughters or mothers or sisters, and they do a lot of weeping, but, we're not sort of following them for their whole story. And so I think for those of us who grew up with those stories, loving them and also feeling frustrated, it's such an exciting thing to get to reach back to the story and honor it, and also speak back to it, expand it, look for the ways that you can continue to kind of push at the edges. And this is something that I think we've been doing with the myths from the very big, since, as soon as they existed, people have been telling them and retelling them. And of course, the Iliad and the Odyssey themselves were originally oral tradition. And so they came out of, people telling and retelling and adapting how they were telling the story to what their audience was responding to, and embroidering it and adding their own little pieces. And, then you have, as soon as Homer existed, the Iliad and the Odyssey existed as set forms, then you immediately have the tragedians going in and writing back to them. And then you have, the Romans, Virgil, Ovid, doing their versions. And so these stories have been interpreted and reinterpreted. So in that sense, I think it's nothing new. Yeah. It's exactly what has been happening ever since they've been around. But there's this excitement that we can sort of open up the world. And one of the things that I love about classics is that, there's the old joke about, these are dead languages, all this stuff is old, but classics is incredibly cutting edge in terms of the archaeology and the technology for how we are learning about the ancient world. I mean, this idea that the statues were painted is really only taking hold in the last sort of 10, 20 years, that people are finally understanding what that means, and that our image of so much of art history is completely wrong.
And that's, I mean, I studied art history in college, in my degrees in art history, and that was 25 years ago. And I remember, like, the first time I read about that was just like, hang on, what?
Right.
Imagine Rome was this sort of suddenly gaudy, colorful paradise. It's trying to change.
Yes. And anyone who's out there listening, I highly recommend Googling reconstructions, of painted Greek statues. And if you're not used to them, you have this moment of like, what? That can't be exactly, how that's not what I'm used to. But I think that there's so many ways that, we're able to read papyrus that we couldn't read before. We're finding all kinds of archaeological things that are really interesting and engaging. And so there's this sense of excitement in the world of classics right now, both because technology is helping us see so much more and know so much more, but also because we're really kind of pushing the edges of what classics means. We're looking at stories of women. We're looking at, we're moving just beyond the stories of men who win in classics, which I think kind of was the default for a long time. So there's all this new ground. And I'm so excited that there are so many passionate young scholars who are coming to the field, because I think we need your passion and we need your voices. And it's a really exciting moment in classics.
And for a lot of people, there will be readers who are classicists of your, reading your novels, and there'll be people who are sort of, who really don't know anything about that, who didn't have a child's guide to the Greek myths. And for a lot of people, your books will be their first introduction to the ancient world and the stories of the ancient world. How do you feel about that sort of role of, of gateway to somebody, for somebody who's coming to Circe without knowing even the pig stuff, which,
getting to be a gateway drug for the Iliad is, basically the greatest compliment I can imagine. So, I love that. And I was a high school teacher for many years, and teaching Latin and Greek also, more Latin than Greek. But I saw that there were absolutely students who came to my classes who felt really alienated from this material. They felt like, shut out from it. They felt like it was boring and old. They felt like it was sort of had been used as this gatekeeping tool, which is absolutely true of classics. Speaking of gatekeeping, I feel like that there has been a lot of sort of, if you know classics, then you're in the club. And if you don't, you're not as, classics has been kind of this cultural passport for a long, long time. And oftentimes that has been incredibly damaging. I mean, the history of classics and white supremacy is extremely disturbing. So I think, first of all, it's important to talk about that stuff. But also, when I was writing these books, I really, really wanted them to be for any reader. I didn't want someone to feel alienated when they picked up this book. If you know classics, there are lots of goodies in these books. But if you don't know classics, I wanted them to be a way to bring readers in. And this was really personal to me for a lot of reasons. For one thing, as I said, having seen my students struggle, students who felt, like this is not for me, I wanted to say, yes, it is. This, this mythology is for everybody. And going back to that tradition of Homer as oral tradition, these were stories that parents told their children and grandparents told, and they were stories that audiences participated in telling, and they were for everyone. And so I sort of wanted to go back to that. And then personally, my best friend growing up hated Greek mythology, absolutely hated it. And whenever I tried to talk about Greek mythology with her, she was, she's like, this is boring. I don't want to hear about it. She was interested in very, different things. And I can remember in the early days of writing Song of Achilles, kind of passionately chattering to her about what I wanted to do with Song of Achilles. And she turned to me and she said, if you say the name Agamemnon one more time to me, I'm going to lose it. And, I said, okay, I won't say it. I'll just show you the book when it's finished. But I totally understand that feeling. The names are long and sometimes they're unfamiliar and it can be complicated. And so I wanted to write this book so that, it could really invite everyone in. And I have to say that the story with my best friend has a happy ending. All credit to her. She was willing to read the novel. And at the end of it, she said, okay, I get it now. Thank you. So she was incredibly gracious.
A convert. That is very impressive. And because obviously you've drawn from so much of your, of research that you've obviously been effectively doing for decades yourself. Was there anything when you were going back to the source material for both books that really made you catch your breath, or really inspired you, or, you know, made you see things in a different way, or set you on a certain path in the novel? I mean, basically, were those old source materials that you did know already, were they capable of surprising you after all these years when you looked at them with a novelist's eye?
Absolutely. And oftentimes when I got stuck, I would go back to the original and read it, and just something would kind of, you know, come unstuck. There was something about it that would jostle something free. I mean, one of the you know, very small pieces that inspired me about Circe is this reference in like a treatise on fishing to Circe arming her son with a stingray tail spear. That's pretty much all it says. And I immediately had this like, oh, what an amazing, like, witchy weapon, stingray tail spear. And my brain, you know, my novelist brain is going, well, but it isn't just any stingray. It's like the lord of all stingrays at the bottom of the ocean, and Circe has to go. And so, you know, I was constructing this scene. It was one of the first scenes that I really thought about as I was thinking about Circe, and I didn't quite know where it fit into the novel, but I knew it was there, this journey to the bottom of the ocean to talk to this gigantic, mysterious creature. And as I got more into it and started thinking about it, I realized, oh, this is my catabasis. This is my going down to the underworld moment, which is, you know, happens in so much of ancient epic. But it came from just this incredibly visceral response to that one, you know, that one moment. And with Patroclus, I was really struck by the number of times that he is represented as being, he's called gentle and also kind to everyone in the Iliad, which is really unusual for an ancient Greek hero. I mean, often it's like, oh, he sacked a lot of cities, and he gave good parties, and he was very generous, and he was good at killing people. But he was kind to everyone, which is how Menelaus describes Patroclus, and he was gentle, which is how Briseis describes Patroclus, was really significant to me. And it was really kind of the core of how I imagined the character. And it began to kind of weave into why he was so meaningful to Achilles, this sort of deep gentleness, but also integrity, the fact that he knows medicine, which is referenced in the Iliad. So all those tiny little scraps, you know, kind of came together. But I did not use everything. For example, there's a story about Circe turning this guy into a woodpecker. It just did not resonate. I didn't use it. Someone else who's writing about Circe could absolutely make an amazing scene with that, but it just didn't speak to me. So the interesting thing about writing about these from a novelist perspective is that, you know, you can kind of pick and choose. You can say, well, what are the parts that resonate and what are the parts that don't? And it's okay to, in fact, you must follow your vision over, you know, you're not writing an academic paper where you have to prove your point and cite every source, which is kind of how I started writing Song of Achilles. And part of why it took me 10 years is that I didn't give myself permission to change enough stuff until I was kind of far down the road. So yes, I think it's always, if any of you out there are working on your own versions of these stories, you know, you don't have to stay close to the material. You can change things, you can completely upend them. How close you are to the source material is not a sign of how successful the retelling will be. What makes a successful retelling is your commitment to your vision of how you're interacting with the material.
And speaking of inspiration, you did post on your Instagram a while ago. Now, there had been obviously reports that you were working on something written on the based on the Tempest, on my old pal Aeneas, or at least on the Aeneid, which I studied in school. But then you showed a screenshot that said you were working on a Persephone novel, which is very exciting. Can you tell us anything about that, even if it's just in its early stages?
Very early stages, but the Persephone story is one that has sort of itched at me for a long time. It's one that I love. I've been frustrated by, but suddenly I sort of had this realization of what my kind of frustration with it was, and how I wanted to tell it. And I know to trust those feelings. So I just dove in, and I have been loving writing from the perspective of Persephone. And the Tempest story is still kind of out there. I have hundreds of pages of it. But you know, it's I feel like in some ways, Persephone and the Tempest are were a little bit tangled up, and by writing the Persephone story, I may end up with both novels kind of at the end of it. But I'm very excited to be writing about Persephone, and the Aeneid is actually a part of that, because of course I love Virgil's depictions of the underworld. He has this incredibly vivid journey through the underworld that Aeneas takes us on. So I'm going back to my Virgil a lot as I'm thinking about the underworld and how I want it to look.
Oh, well, I think readers will be very, very excited to hear all this. And speaking of your readers, we do have lots of questions.
Wonderful.
Some of the questions kind of we've covered in the conversation, but the Nace Community College asks, do you like the character of Circe? Why or why not?
I do. I mean, I think it would be hard to live with a character in my head, you know, for so long and really dislike them. I know that there are novelists who do that, but that would be challenging for me. But I also recognize that Circe doesn't always make great choices. And part of that was that I wanted to give her the same epic scope that the Greek male heroes have had, by right for millennia. I mean, both Odysseus and Achilles make absolutely, terrible mistakes in their respective epics. They cause destruction pretty much wherever they go. And, their names even kind of carry that. Achilles, possibly comes from words that mean grief to the people. Odysseus's name is etymologically related to the word for being hated. So, it's part of what I want to do with Circe is to give her that same ability to make terrible mistakes that epic heroes have always had. But part of what I really love about Circe is that she never gives up, that she always tries again. And, she never stops thinking. And I think this really comes out also in her parenting. That, at the end of every day, even when she feels like she hasn't done a good job, being a parent, and she has no models, of course, for being a good parent, she still comes back and says, tomorrow I'm going to do better, and tomorrow I'm going to do better. And that was a part of Circe that really, really spoke to me, is her desire to keep learning and to keep challenging herself and to keep understanding. But, one of the things that I also wanted to look at in terms of Circe is the idea of internalized misogyny, which is where, in a society where women are treated as lesser, women also treat other women as lesser, that it isn't just men who are doing that women internalize that sort of negative feeling towards other women. And I think particularly at the beginning of the novel, I wanted Circe to have to struggle with that. She gets very angry at someone she's in love with, Glaucus, and she's angry at him, but the person she lashes out at instead is this other nymph. And then she has to live with the fact that she's done that for the rest of her eternity. So I didn't want her to be a perfect character at all. And I think part of her regret and her grief is for the mistakes she's made. But that's what makes her complicated, and that's what makes her interesting. And I wanted all of that to be in there, because I think it's true for all of us. We're all messy and we all make mistakes. I hope, we don't necessarily transform people into monsters, but we make mistakes. And how do we live with the mistakes we've made? How do we go forward? How do we do better? That was kind of what I was interested in with Circe. And in that sense, I think she's very different from Achilles and Odysseus, who don't really seem that interested or that guilty about many of their mistakes. So, I do like her. I do like her quite a bit.
Well, St. Paul's Secondary School in Green Hills in Dublin, one of their they've asked a few questions, but I think my favorite is, when Circe is bored, is she fully grown or a baby?
Great question.
I know, like, the way that those ancient gods reproduced, who knows?
Yes, that's such a great, and it's also complicated by the fact that the way ancient artists would portray children is as grown-ups but small.
Yes.
So oftentimes you'll see like vase paintings with like the child Achilles, but it's a grown person but just like shrunk down. So it's a little confusing, but in my imagination, because as the writer, of course, I have to, I can say as a classicist, oh, there are lots of different ways to look at it. But as a novelist, I actually have to know the answer for my novel. So my answer was that she was born a baby, but that she grows incredibly quickly. That, they grow up basically in sort of a blink.
Yeah, they don't have a childhood that a mortal human would have.
Yes, yes, exactly. Although they're still very immature. They look grown up, but their brains are not necessarily mature.
Well, the St. Paul's also asked, and I did, because I cannot read ancient Greek or modern Greek for that matter. I had to do a copy and paste to figure out what these letters were. But they ask, why is the word nostos in the dedication at the start of the book?
Nostos is one of the key concepts of the Odyssey. It means homecoming. In ancient Greek, and it's a word, we actually have an English word that uses that, the word nostalgia. The nostos is homecoming and algia is pain, and so nostalgia is that pang we feel when we think about home or going home, that sort of pain in us when we think back to home. And Odysseus spends the entire Odyssey longing for his nostos, his homecoming. And I really saw that as an incredible, center for Circe's story as well, that she is also looking for her nostos, her homecoming. Except unlike Odysseus, it's not an island, at the end of his journey where his wife is waiting, where his son is waiting. Circe's nostos is, she doesn't even know what kind of home she's looking for. She's in flight from her home are her terrible parents, the gods and everything that they bring. And so she's trying to create a home and find it, and sort of find that homecoming out in the world, as opposed to going back to something. And so nostos is that idea of homecoming, and the person that the novel is dedicated to is a home for me.
Oh, that's a lovely answer. Close the end in Galway. Well, we've answered their question, because it's, do you plan to stay in the realm of Greek mythology for your next book? And we know that's true, but I guess looking forward, after that, you just alluded to two other texts, one Latin and one English, that you're interested in. I mean, you have described your work as, which I loved, mythological realism, and as a form of literary adaptation. So, can you see yourself being inspired by any other texts from over the centuries? Because obviously there's a huge gap between Virgil and Homer, and the gap between Homer or Virgil and Shakespeare.
I think right now there's no other text that I'm looking at other than, in particular, Shakespeare's Tempest. And I think the Tempest has always interested in me, because I find it, I don't like directing it at all. I find it very frustrating to direct. And so I think that, there's that frustration that I feel that makes me want to kind of go in there and reimagine it a different way. But I could also see myself actually writing contemporary novels, or novels that are not necessarily based on a myth or on something that's pre-existing, that I wouldn't be surprised if eventually I ended up there. So, for me, it always has to come from a place of sort of obsession and passion. I have to feel like I have something really that I'm desperate to say about a particular myth or a particular story. So right now, the Tempest is still out there, the Aeneid is still out there, and then possibly, nothing to do with myths at all.
Oh, watch this space. Loretto College in Fox Rock asked, who is your favorite character in the Song of Achilles?
Oh, That is such a good question. So I'm going to set aside Patroclus. Obviously, he's my favorite character. I lived with him for 10 years, talking in my ear. So I have quite a lot of affection for him. But setting him aside, I think it's a sort of two-way tie. And we'll set Achilles aside too. But setting those two aside, I think Briseis and Thetis were my two favorite characters to write. Briseis in particular. I found her story incredibly moving. She was one of the characters where I made kind of a significant change from the Iliad, which is that in the Iliad, she is a princess who has been taken captive. But I felt like there are a lot of aristocrats in the story already. And I was really interested in the damage that was being done to all the farmers who lived around, all the people who lived around the city of Troy, who had absolutely no say in the fact that this war was happening, no control over this war, no ability to escape this war. And yet, they were the ones who are being raided, destroyed, killed because the Greeks need food. And so they're just going to be kind of moving through the countryside and destroying, that's how you support a 10-year long siege, is you destroy everything in the countryside. And so she was a farmer's daughter, and imagining her her personality, I knew that she was going to be one of the pillars of the novel for me, and that her relationship with Patroclus, their friendship and their bond was going to be really significant. But writing her scenes were always felt really resonant and really meaningful to me.
Well, the last questions come from St. Mary's College in Dublin. Now they have, I don't know, they have a bone to pick with you, but they are wondering why.
I welcome all bone picking.
Yeah, they ask how in some of in the Song of Achilles, sometimes maybe I'm paraphrasing here, but that you reduce the amount of divine intervention from from the original from the Iliad anyway, and yet at some stages we see, say, Aphrodite guide Paris's arrow. So they're asking, why did you pull back on the divine intervention at some stages and then emphasize it in another? I don't know whether they ask, are there any sources or documents to back Aphrodite's involvement? So
we know from the Iliad, that's such a good question, and thank you, students, for reading it so carefully and so thoughtfully. That is the ultimate honor as a writer, to have your work read thoughtfully and questioned and thought about. So thank you. In terms of pulling back on the divine intervention, I sort of imagined that the Iliad was the story that would come out of, someone's actual life. And so it would be embroidered and added to, and there would be more divinity, and there would be more sort of stuff that was, that kind of accrued around it. And so it made sense to scale back some of that, divine intervention as I was writing it. And I really wanted to keep the focus on, it was a very intimate story that I was telling. And so I wanted to keep the focus on Achilles, on Patroclus, and, Thetis as a nymph is actually not a very powerful goddess, but she's incredibly shocking to Patroclus every time she appears, because she does have that alien quality of the gods. And so I wanted to sort of keep the focus on Thetis, but then slowly we start to realize that there's this larger world of the gods, who come into play around Patroclus's death, that are ultimately actually much more frightening than Thetis is. But it was a way to kind of look at the different levels of gods. So we know that Aphrodite is, there supporting Paris and helping Paris. We see her intervene in the Iliad about Paris. And so, part of what I wanted to do is to sort of suggest, and all this is reported by Patroclus. So, he doesn't see Aphrodite do anything. He assumes, or he wonders, or he hears, that possibly she's involved. We know she's he is Aphrodite's favorite. And so part of what I wanted to do in those moments is not necessarily to say like, yes, definitively this happened, because he doesn't see it happen, but to, suggest that in this world, there may be many more gods who are doing things, even if they're not interested in you. And the uncertainty of what it's like to navigate a world like that, where, was that just lucky, or was that a god, or, I wanted sort of some of that confusion.
Well, thank you to everybody who sent questions from Nace Community College, Loretto College, St. Stephen's Green, St. Paul's Secondary School in Green Hills, Clortha Enda in Galway, Loretto College in Foxrock in Dublin, and St. Mary's in Dublin, who were doing their very close reading of the text there. And thank you so much, Madeleine. It has been a delight to talk to you, and I am very, very excited about Persephone. A lot of the viewers who are watching are sharing that excitement. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. This was just such a joy. I wish I could have every conversation with you. and thank you to all the students also for your incredible questions and for reading so closely.
Well, Classics Now is continuing over the weekend, so you can check out all the other events in person and online, and Walete, everybody, and thank you. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you.